Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today, which is about redemption. When you think about the word redemption or redeem, I wonder if you can name two things that are redeemed. I spent a little time trying to think about what is redeemed. I can think of our lives are redeemed by God, by the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And coupons are redeemed. Why in the world are these the two things that get redeemed? They seem so disparate. A soul and, send a coupon in after you buy a bucket of paint. How is it that redemption somehow applies to these two very different sorts of items? We get the word redemption from Latin. It simply means a buyback. So that when we redeem a coupon, that seems to make some sort of sense. But then it becomes more complicated as we think about how our souls are redeemed. Who would God be buying our souls back from? Why were they sold in the first place? What sort of theology about finance and economy was at play whenever the notion of redemption of ourselves came into practice? We can read about redemption in the Old Testament, but it often comes in the weird and murky texts of Leviticus and Numbers. Whenever values were placed on animals and sacrifices. One of the earliest references in the Bible to redemption comes from an ox goring a person to death. That'd be Leviticus. I'm sure it's your favorite book of the Bible. I wonder if we can take anything from that ancient text whenever so few of us have to deal with ox gorings on a regular weekly basis. How can those conceptions that were so foundational for talking about the value of human life apply to the ways we think about redemption poetically in the 21st century? How do we understand today the value of a human life in serious financial matters? How does the church in general talk about finances and the buyback or the forgiveness of what we owe? I've been musing about these things because I'm reading a book I don't think I quite recommend, even though I like it, called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, an anthropological look at how people understood value and exchanged things among themselves. He tries to present something a little bit different than what you might have remembered from your Economics 101 class, where you have bread and I have butter, and when there's a double coincidence that we should exchange, we can. Instead, Graeber says that we find in ancient civilizations and our own a million ways that we find ourselves indebted to one another. Not only thinking about our mortgages and our credit cards, but the ways that we borrow a tool from a neighbor, and so next week we take them a loaf of bread. These little gratitudes that we pass back and forth, the gifts we give around the office, they're ways that we talk about our indebtedness or our gratitude to one another. Maybe you don't use this phrase that often, but you'd say something like, I owe you a debt of gratitude or a debt of thanks. When we pray, Father, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, how are these sorts of financial metaphors connected, again, to the most important things like the redemptions of our lives by the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus? How do these things weave together? Well, that's what I've been musing about. And so there's a lot to say. It includes oikos Greek yogurt, Wendellberry and nature, and the year of Jubilee, and how we think about jubilation. So if you have time for those sorts of weird and disparate connections, I hope you'll stick around. Usually I try not to read so often whenever I do these musings, but since I'm not all that familiar with the ox goring passages of the Bible, I thought I would just read them to you, so you can enjoy your cup of coffee and think about ox goring. Listen for the word of God. This is Exodus chapter 21, in verse 28. The subtitle is Laws Concerning Property. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh should not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall not be liable. If the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned, but has not restrained it, and the ox kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also should be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on the owner, then the owner shall pay whatever is imposed for the redemption of the victim's life. That term redemption starts to sound like something that an insurance salesman would be marketing in the ancient Near East. It makes some sense on some level that if an animal or maybe in the 21st century we say a piece of farm equipment gets away from somebody and it hurts someone, the owner, maybe it's an accident and maybe the owner is liable. Liable for what? Well, for the life of the person who's been injured or who has died. But what do we say? You could just pay your way out of your liability? The ancient Near Eastern practices that seem to make some sense, that try to make recompense or redemption for things that have gone wrong, must necessarily put some value on human life. That if I were to cause harm to my neighbor, I would owe my neighbor. But what? How do we talk about a quantity that would help make up for the person's loss? If an airplane crashes today, we're stuck with a similar situation. If you're in an auto accident and someone's injured, there's money behind what we're talking about. And if we can't pay, how are we supposed to understand what the value of human life is? So we have the story of ox goring. If we read a few chapters later in Leviticus 27, the last chapter of Leviticus, we would see the story of Jubilee. That maybe it's not in life that we owe people, but we owe land. If I couldn't pay my neighbor for this ox goring that keeps popping up in this musing today, maybe I could give a section of my property. But what if I wanted the property back? What if I came into the money? How do I redeem the land? How does it come to belong to me again? That's what Jubilee was all about, that every 50 years, people who had sold property, sold daughters into marriage, sold sons into indentured servitude, every 50 years, there was something like a reset button, a Jubilee. I think that was the idea behind the movie Fight Club, right at the end. What are the buildings that are being blown up? They're the credit card companies. That we labor under our debts to one another. And sometimes, somehow, some people seem to own a lot of property, more than they could ever use. In the ancient Near East, they would own a lot of people. You might think of managers who don't treat their employees well. Employees who have mortgages and private school and college funds to pay for, so they labor and labor, never quite having the freedom that we would hope for to be able to be entrepreneurial or to really tell that boss what they really think. Redemption is somehow in this mix. Jubilee is somehow in this mix. What is Jubilee? In some sense, concretely, it meant the forgiveness of debts or the redemption of people every 50 years. But we use Jubilee or jubilation as a synonym for joy, excitement. We should use it as a connection to freedom, specifically economic freedom. The freedom we can enjoy when we are not pressed down by the debts that we owe to one another, whether financial or figurative. And that's where I want to talk about Greek yogurt. My favorite brand of Greek yogurt is Oikos, and I wish I had a commercial to insert here, but I don't. Oikos means house in Greek. That's why it's the name of a Greek yogurt. But you probably see the prefix for oikos in a couple of words that you hear often. Eco, oikos, oika, eco. So ecology and economy come from that same root. Economy means the laws of the house. Ecology means the logic of the house. How might we understand ourselves to be indebted to our households? Not just in the mortgage, but the people in our households. When we divvy up our chores, when we realize what our parents were able to do for us whenever they ironed and drove us around places when we were younger. How do we understand our indebtedness to the environment? In some concrete ways, you know that there is a financial cost to the environments that we live in. If you live in Alaska, you probably pay more for heat than you do if you live in Florida. That we are connected to the environment and there's a certain logic to it. When we invest in the land, we do things that clean up our environment, give us clean water and fresh air. There's a cost to that in the ways that we buy things, the ways that we clean up. We have sanitation, water sanitation plants and those sorts of things. There's a logic to it. We also get returns from the land whenever we, as a society, harvest timber or we mine for coal or whatever the case may be. We take from the deposits that we've made. How do we think about our indebtedness to the land? We can think about that indebtedness if we finally come to the spiritual or theological notion of redemption. God is redeeming all things. God is buying back all things. God is liberating and freeing all things so that they live in jubilation. That they work together on a sort of equal playing field. And I say sort of for a very important reason. David Graeber, in the book that I mentioned earlier, talks about a society where if you are indebted to your neighbor, you never quite pay them back perfectly. It would be a massive offense to pay someone back penny for penny. Because when someone's paid back penny for penny, you no longer need to do business with that person. So if I was to come to your house and borrow a cup of sugar, and I weighed it down to the microgram, and I brought you back exactly the amount that you needed so that we would be even Steven, that means that I wouldn't have brought you a loaf of bread. And because the bread was maybe a little more than the sugar, you would have no reason to come back over to my house and help me set up a bouncy castle for Gwyneth. Well, setting up a bouncy castle on a Saturday, that's a lot. So I probably should go and bring a casserole to you. And because I brought the casserole, that means you bring beer to watch the game over at my house. We do this tit for tat, where we're always a little indebted to one another. And no tabs are kept. We just, somewhere in the back of our mind, think we've had a good relationship. And we're both indebted to one another. I wonder what that means about God's redemption of the world. Is our hope that God squares up everything with us? In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7, I think we have something of an answer there. Paul is talking about the sacrifice that Jesus makes for us. The Redeemer of the world sacrifices a blameless life for the redemption of the world, something that is of immeasurable value. In some sense, we could say the entire world then is forever indebted to Christ. But if we could never pay that back, do we consider that a debt at all? Just like on another note, thanks David Graeber, does a nation ever have to pay back its debt whenever it issues bonds? And it's a whole other thing. I'm not an economist, so I won't talk about that. But I will say that if we understand God's redemption of the world to be so much more than we could ever pay back, what does that mean for how we think about living redeemed lives, living in freedom, and somehow in the back of our minds understanding that we can live with a debt of gratitude, a debt of thanks, where we continue to serve because we have been forgiven of our debts, we can forgive other people's debts. Sometimes that might refer to actual money, like whenever you buy your brother's guitar because he needs a little cash to move. Maybe it involves cash and maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just means the smiles and the kindness that we show one another in the normal everyday walks about the city that we might do. When we read that God is our Redeemer, why would we think about ox goring? It's such a beautiful picture that God is our Redeemer, that God has purchased us, that we would have been ransomed and God somehow takes our place. But the further we dive into that notion of redemption, the stranger it becomes. So I've been musing about how we are supposed to process it that week. How do we owe one another grace, love, and kindness? How does money come into that picture? Does the story of redemption say anything about college debt, medical debt, or our mortgages? How are we supposed to think about jubilee and jubilation? How do we understand economic and ecological freedom? I think they're all connected, even if I haven't quite put all the pieces of the puzzle together quite perfectly. That's why I'm musing with you. I'd be interested to hear how you think God is redeeming the world. What might that mean? What is the value of a human life, your life? And how do we get our house, our economy, and our ecology working together in some way that makes sense, in a redemptive way? That's what I've been musing about. I hope you might muse about that a little bit too. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next Monday.